Welcome to all of you people and welcome to spring. Uh, I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about something extremely difficult to understand for a lot of people, which is the anatomy of social action, something that I've kind of looked at many years. There are thousands of books about these things. I was listening to Chris Higgins last night and realized how depressing he is. If you survive listening to Chris Higgins for a couple of hours, you're doing pretty good. I need lots of vodka, I think, to get through that. But he's trying to unpack things for today and look for the extreme complexity of things which are behind the story. And I give him kudos for at least trying to make some of that at work. They say it takes a genius to make complex ideas simple. So I'm not a genius. So you know that this is not going to be the way it's going to spell out this morning. But I'm going to try and give you an understanding or an insight into kind of how we think, some of us think within ethical culture about ethical actions and how to develop them and what to do. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about one of Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture, one of his kind of heroes, who he eventually rejects, but for a different reason, the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Kant is extremely difficult to read. If any of you have ever tried to read him, he makes absolutely no sense, the way that Emerson makes no sense sometimes. But he was trying to get at very complex ideas also and explain them for people who may understand kind of what he was talking about. And this is what he said. He said, humans have a kind of an innate capacity within our brains to understand moral reasoning. When even a young child who's not been trained in arcane philosophical ideas or these things can look at something that's unjust and know that it's unjust. And for Kant, how did that get there? What is it? I mean, Aristotle believed that couple thousand years ahead of them, that how is it that we can understand complex phenomena in the world? There must be something built within our structure of our brain that allows us to process this information. And Kant kind of draws on that a little bit, that somehow we humans have the ability to look at some things and know that they're unjust or that something is wrong, that we have this innate capacity within our brains. What Kant then says is, it doesn't sound like we need religions or theology anymore, because we don't need to reason our way to how to be good. What we need to do is to find a way to nurture that innate capacity. That's something within us. How do you just nurture that? It doesn't need some abstract kind of out there belief system. It already resides within us. We don't need to put it in, it's already within. And therefore we can somehow find a way to do this. And he searched for that through his philosophy. And one way he thought is you just needed to act as if it was there, that we can act in some kind of a reasoned pathway. And if we use the right kind of reasons, then we could discover what that innate kind of system is within us. It's interesting when you think about what Charles Darwin, writing quite a bit later, who also kind of was interested about humans' innate capacity for a couple of things which we seem to evolve with. We seem to have been evolved with the ability for cognition, but we've also seemed to be evolved with the capacity for caring. And he says that's really interesting. We weren't taught to care. We weren't taught to love other people. We weren't taught to think through things. These things evolved within us because of the pressures of evolution, and that these things innately reside within us. And that somehow we have to just bring those things to light, because caring and thinking and feeling empathic towards other people is part of who we are, that has evolved under complex thinking for quite a long time. Adler, of course, in his own book, looked at both of these kind of thoughts. In fact, he mentions both Immanuel Kant and Charles Darwin in his own. But for Felix Adler, there was something not quite right with these these models that somehow they say, okay, the capacity resides within us almost as a static gift, that it's there, and that we just need to cultivate it, perhaps they would say. But Adler thought that it's more than that, that somehow humans working together, humans collaborating, and in that act of being with one another, doing the right thing, something else bigger is made manifest. We glimpse something that is even bigger than what it resides in the individual, right? So the individual is one place that it resides in all the other individuals, this innate capacity that Kant and Darwin talked about, but somehow we have to kind of bring that out to life. Now, I'm going to have you set that aside again. Once again, it's not a, I'm not a genius. I'm going to make complex things even more complex. Let's talk about innate capacities that other people have noticed and other philosophers have noticed over the years that also seem to reside within human doing and how these kinds of things shape our ideas. Adam Smith, of course, was a moral philosopher. He's the guy who wrote A Wealth of Nations, and a lot of people think was the father of capitalism. But to really understand Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, you have to think about what was his main goal. And what Adam Smith wanted was an economic system that actually elicited the best from the world and best from community. It brought the greatest amount of joy and happiness, and that an economic system should be a moral system overall. And he wanted to figure out what that is. But he was also a keenly astute observer of economic systems because he wanted to figure out first, what is the magic there that we could kind of bring that would somehow elicit our best? And the more he studied intensely economic systems, he points out something else, that when economic systems or people engaged in economic activities over a long period of time do these things, it produces more and more than the sum of its parts. That somehow, for example, if you have a bunch of people trying to make a pen, this was his example. One person is making a pen and they're shaping it, they're doing the metal, and they're doing all the work. But if you took 10 people to make pens, you would think that how many persons a pen a person could make an hour, and you added those up together would just be 10 times that amount. But it's not. It was well more than that. And when he looked at capital, he said it's almost as if when things come together in a certain way, it produces well more than if one or two people had acted independently. He described this using a funny term that a lot of people misunderstood. He called it the invisible hand. It's almost as if there's another partner there working, and he didn't call it God, that there was this another thing that was working with us that somehow allowed capitalism to produce more than it could. And it just needed the kind of relationships that needed to be happening there. For him, of course, if we just acted in our own self-interest, that us working together in relationship with other people also acting in their own self-interest, that collectively, just as in the pin factor, the invisible hand would create something more than what we started with. And he thought that that could lead eventually to produce, as capitalism has to, for many people who proponent, who believe in it, more housing, more food distribution, greater economies across the United States, and all these things. This is a tough room to sell capitalism to, I'm gonna have to tell you this. But he thought that somehow you could just keep adding to that, and capitalism produced more and more, and that this was kind of a moral end if we set that in the correct path. Karl Marx, of course, was a big fan of Adam Smith and talks about Adam Smith in his books. It's funny to think that the father of communism was also a great fan of Adam Smith. He was also a keen observer of history, and like Adam Smith, wanted to create economies that led to more ethical systems, to more fair distribution, to less exploitation. One of the things, of course, that he was, that people had no longer access to their own labor, that there was a lack of creativity. And he also, though, understood that when systems come together, economic systems, particularly labor and material goods, that they could produce more, that we could eventually create a society, he actually thought, where the workers wouldn't have to do anything but enjoy the fruits of their labors, while somehow we created an economic system which would bring about more and more. He thought that this was rooted in the exchange of materials and human labor, that it wasn't just in the ideas that would make this happen, like Hegel, the man who influenced him, but instead it would also be how these material things happen. And if you could control this, they would continue to produce more and more and more. And if we could just steer it in the right direction, it would lead to less exploitation of the labor class, more creativity, and more democratic freedom. Didn't quite work out that way, but that's exactly what he was hoping to get to. So these early philosophers, including Darwin, who said there's a capacity within nature to do something amazing, to create more than what it's supposed to do. And you had to think about the science behind it at the time, which is most importantly, the second law of thermodynamics. Didn't know you'd be talking about thermodynamics on a Sunday morning, but here we are. According to the second law of thermodynamics, we progress from order to disorder or to chaos, and that it doesn't ever go the opposite direction. And therefore, things should, in a closed system, they should go from high states of order down to greater chaos, less order, and the system kind of falls apart. And yet, what didn't make sense to a lot of people is, if Darwin is correct, we seem to be heading in the opposite direction. For some, of course, they said, well, you know, the Earth is not a closed system, it's an open system because we have the energy of the sun that's pouring down us, and that may explain it. But that wasn't enough for everyone. There's a whole group of scientists, quote unquote scientists, who believe in Christian beliefs, of course, that somehow the reason why this order is heading in the opposite direction is only because of God. And this whole belief system we call creationism, that because of the second law of thermodynamics and because complexity should be leading to more chaos and disorder, that some being has to play a role in that to send it the other direction, right? But actually, that's not true for a lot of different reasons. When we came finally to the age of supercomputers and a type of math which we now call chaos math, and began to look at these things more and more, we discovered that actually the law of thermodynamics, this movement, this energy of flowing in direction, can be utilized in a system as also a source of power, leading to higher and higher levels of complexity. So for example, take robins looking for worms and hawks looking for robins, basically on a spring sunny day outside your day. Go outside, there's gonna be a robin pecking at the ground, trying to get the worm to pop its head up, and look at the hawks circling above, looking for the robins. And for them, if you take just the robin and the worm and the hawks and you add them all together, they should not produce the complex system that they do. But they do. The world operates in a non-linear fashion, a non-Newtonian linearity, we say, that it actually could produce more complex, and that robins and worms and hawks can create ecosystems. They can create something bigger and more powerful through their interactions than the sum of the parts. And that's the important part to get there, that nature can produce more than the sum of its parts and can create complex systems. And those complex systems can in turn create more complex systems, and the direction according to chaos theory and the math emerging from our ability to use supercomputers can continue to produce more and more. That may have been what Adam Smith noted, what Darwin noted, what Karl Marx noted, and with other philosophers had noted, that things working dynamically together do seem to produce more. And if we can understand that, we might get some ideas of what's going on. Now, the notion of this emergent system, of course, has taken off most profoundly within biology, but it's taking off in many fields as well. And that things are getting more complex, and that they're more than the aggregate parts. And we could discover these things. But they does also discover that there seem to be certain rules that have to be in place for this emergence to happen. So in order for some things collectively working together to produce more than the sum of their parts, there are a couple of things that we've just recently with the math and the science have been able to say what those are. The first thing is that the system needs a certain amount of autonomy. It needs a certain amount of chaos and vigor and freedom. It needs that in order to create the messiness from which new orders and new complexities can merge and work together. So you have to have that level of kind of autonomy, which tells you probably why Marx's system eventually collapsed and didn't work. He was trying to control it too much. The second thing is you need communication and contact with the other parts, that they can't be isolated, discrete things, that they have to work together and have the communication and contact with the other on a basis. You can't just have monocultures working together to produce complexity. You have to have all of these things together, and they have to be interacting with each other. Think of a field of flowers out there on a spring day, and all the different kinds of plants and insects and birds and pollinators and nutrient cycling and all these things that are happening together, all in a buzzing, coming together and happening to make that whole work. The third law is that there has to be some inclusivity to that in this niche is fitting together. Since not only do they have contact with one another, but there has to be a way for these groups to get together. And if you're just saying, okay, we have had contact with them, but we don't really want them here, that's not going to work. That somehow there has to be a welcoming to the system, an inclusivity, this kind of working where niches in the biological system all kind of work together, even if somewhere to some extent they're operating independently. They have found a way for these niches to come together and to interact with one another. The fourth thing that the biologists say has to make this system work is it has to have what they call the law of requisite variety. You need diversity. You need very highly diverse systems with lots of different parts interacting with one another, communicating with one another, sharing the same space. Once again, monocultures don't work, or places where there are only a few things allowed to participate, because the law of requisite variety says that that doesn't work over time. And we've seen that repeated in history again and again and again, where people do want the kind of freedom, they do want communication, but for their own and not for the others, and certainly not including the others as well. And then the last most important part of emergent systems in biology is something called reciprocity, that there is a give and take between the parts of this. And when this happens, when there's autonomy and chaos and messiness and freedom and communication and inclusivity, and all of these parts, diverse parts are working together, and if there's this reciprocity, this give and take, this sharing of nutrients, this symbiosis of activity, and all these things that go where things from one are shared by things of the other, then emergence can happen. And those 5 things and those parts come together and they produce an ecosystem or a biome that produces even more than what was originally there. Quite of an exciting type of things. And only since supercomputers have we been able to model that. We looked at things in nature, we guessed at it, but with only the supercomputers could we run them and actually show, putting in these laws and mathematical formula, that actually, yes, the system can produce more as long as we're there. And we have the math to kind of understand it and unpack these things. So perhaps the things that that Adam Smith saw, and Darwin, Marx, and even Adler to a certain extent, is that there is this capacity within things working together to produce more in our universe. Our planet produces well beyond, through food production, through energy production, and these other things, well beyond its capacity that it originally done, because of these ways that we've interacted. Unfortunately, we've kind of done that in the wrong way. And we've also done it in ways, of course, that have broken some of the laws. We've been exclusive rather than inclusive. We've pushed for monocultures such as racism rather than diversity. And capitalism, and the way it has produced, has also led to exploitation and slavery, of course, and Marxism, of course, has led to many other problems as well. So these things are not simple. They're very, very complex, as the proponents of them say. But one of the things that every time they saw that one of the principles of the laws of the biomes are missing, that this is what happens, and this is why it's happening. Now, here is what I think Adler was trying to do, and here's what I think makes it more interesting for some of us. As a conservation scientist, of course, and someone who works in these things all the time, I really kind of look at complexities of nature and think about these rules and think about the ways that environmental science, working in collaboration with species and with humans especially, can maybe bring about greater change to the system that we have. By the way, two signs that an emergent system has sufficiently made it, the two signs that we've jumped to the next level, shall we say, is if the system is more sustainable and if it's more resilient. Sustainability and resiliency are the hallmarks of an effective biological system that's made the leap to the next level. Now, what if instead of putting a economic system or a biological niche at the top of that equation, what if we were thinking about this in terms of ethics and morality, about what does it need to happen if we were to unpack moral ethical systems using the same kind of way that the biologists have now looked at biomes and ecosystems as well. And then we're looking about what would lead to a higher kind of more complex ethical system, something that's also sustainable and resilient, but a system that allows for its parts to have more than what they began with. And I know this sounds crazy to some of you, but coming from the background of an environmental scientist and looking at Adler's work, I think that's kind of what he was attempting to say. Like Kant before him, he noticed that, of course, we do seem to have this innate moral capacity. That is, that there is something within us. He didn't dispute with Darwin that perhaps it arose through evolutionary pressure, our capacity to care for others, our capacity to feel empathy, our horror when we see something getting killed or slaughtered. Those things perhaps did evolve within us, and they do reside within us. But he was also thinking about this thing which he called ethical energy, that somehow, from Adler's perspective, somehow when some things just come together the right kind of ways, then some system emerges that itself is more complex and is better, and that we could get glimpses of that thing. Adler was no scientist, and he was certainly no biologist, but I think he did grasp something essential, the same way that Adam Smith, Darwin, and Marx may have grasped as well, that there was something emergent about all of this if we just did things a certain way. And if you looked at the types of things that Adler was suggesting, you'll find a shocking similarity between what he was suggesting and those rules of biology and emergent systems I talked about before. The first, of course, is that notion of autonomy and freedom and chaos. He wanted to make sure that it wasn't about just prescriptive ethical beliefs. We were going to do away with that. We were going to allow individuals to be a part of this kind of search for ideas, that we in ethical culture are not going to hand you a paper or a book and say, this is what you want. That somehow this is an emergent thing, that something is coming out of this, and that we're discovering in a way what those things are. And you need the intellectual freedom to be able to do that, right? We always say when you come to an ethical door society, you don't check your conscience at the door. You don't say, I'm just going to listen while they talk once again about how bad gay people are, or why we all need prayer in the public schools. That we're going to come in this wrestling of ideas in this somewhat chaotic way, this freedom. We were going to do that. In this place on a Sunday morning, for example, this platform where we get together and these ideas get shared, hopefully with freedom as well. The second thing is he believed that there would be communication and contact with other parts. He wanted us to come together in groups and to listen to one another. Adler's original idea is that we would all live in shared housing, right? We'd have a house with a center kitchen dining area and 4 hallways with different families. And over there would be the carpenter's family. Over here would be the engineer's family. Over here would be the nurse's family. Over there is the educator's family. And that all of us would come together in that kind of thing where we have all touched the different parts and we would share in this combined space, and our contact and our communication with one another would elicit new kinds of ethical insights. The other thing he argued strongly is for inclusivity and these niches fitting together. This was his notion of organicity, which is this other 19th century language, which is very difficult for us to understand. But essentially that you have all these discrete parts, you have these unique persons with their own unique insights hooking together. And all of these things coming together need to somehow fit together and participate within one another in this thing called the manifold, this multiple piece device, this thing with all of the parts in there, where it would all come together, but realize that it's connected together. But the most important other part of that was diversity and the law of requisite variety, that your moral experiences are going to be uniquely different from my own to a certain extent. We're all going to have different kinds of things that we know that add to life and tear in life. We come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different genders, different family households and raisings, and each of us in a way is a unique part of an ecosystem. And we have other groups around the planet who are also coming from unique things. And each of them has a piece of this bigger part, this diversity that's needed to bring it together. Which brings us to his last part about this, which is reciprocity. That there has to be a give and take between these parts. That they just can't come together and sit there and wave friendly. They're not just talking with one another. They're not just allowing and being tolerant of diversity, but we're actually working to elicit the unique life force within the other person, because that also brings forth something within us. And for Adler, when all of this right energizing comes together, he thought, when all of these things were happening, we would then come to the next level, that it would bring something emergent, a new form of ethical identity and ethical insights, which would be transformative to everything. In fact, that's one of the other key pieces of the biological system, in that when all of the parts, the robins and the hawks and the birds and the nutrients and all of the things come together to a certain extent, when their new system emerged, it would exert a downward pressure and shape the participant parts as well, right? So now the robin modifies its behavior a little bit differently because it's now part of an ecosystem. The worms, the hawks, the flowers, all of them feel the downward pressure of the new emergent system and adjust and find new ways to grow and to merge with that as well. And for Adler, that was very similar to what his thinking was, that when a new emergent ethical system would come about through all this process that we had, that it would create a downward pressure on the way to all the parts. and cause for transformation within them as well. So you act to elicit the ethical best within others. You create a culture, a society for an ethical culture that allowed for autonomy, that allowed for communication, that looked at who was sick and found a way to send the visiting nurse service to heal them and bring them back into there, to look at those who didn't have the education that they needed for the autonomy and feeling included in the part, to look at creation of the legal aid society to see who those were who were barred from the participating in this event. And somehow, if you created that ethical system, and with us acting to elicit, something would emerge, this bigger ethical thing, which could be transformative to the society as well. So that was the easy version of the story. You want the difficult version of the story? I like this in a way, and I have drawn heavily upon it because it fits a lot of the work that I do on a daily basis, which is working with communities. I know I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, wow, climate change is rushing our way. We've got to educate the youth. You're a national youth program director. You need to get out there and create more programs where we just tell the youth how bad the world is going to get. You know, it's like, once again, listening to Chris Higgins or walking to some ethical societies where on Sunday we should just stop publishing the names of our talks and should just put up there, you think the world is bad, just wait till you hear this next platform. I think sometimes we do that with our youth as well, that we want to educate them and force this idea that things are bad, which they've already heard. They already know that half of them are living it right now. They don't really need us to tell them anything more about that. And instead of doing that, what I'd like to do, and what I've often done with my youth, is to find a way of right energizing. What is it that stops them from participating in this great big thing of life? How can I help them not think as I do, but give them the autonomy, the freedom, the communication, the inclusivity, the diversity, and those actions of reciprocity? How can I stick those into a system that they come out of it knowing much about what is life, what's the stuff of life, and what's hampering their way along that way as well? And that's the way I've been producing this within my organization, Groundwork, for a lot of years, to some pretty amazing results. Just to give you an example, when I looked back after 10 years of running a program that I did in Yonkers, I wanted to see what impact I had on the youth. How many of them, what did they do with their lives, and where are they now? And I could track down over the course when I did the study about 72. So not a big sample, but out of 100, that I'm pretty close, 70%. Of those, I wanted to see what they did with their life, and we tracked them down to see where they're gone. In a school district where 67% of people graduate from high school, 100% of the youth had graduated from high school. In a school district where 23% matriculated into college, 92% had matriculated into college. And of those, 54% had gone into science or conservation related fields. I hardly ever talked about how bad the world was getting. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. I just focused on giving them the tools to control their own life, to shape their own destiny, to feel included by hooking them with other scientists and feeling like they're part, by putting them in the same uniform that I did, by no longer even using the word kids, I only use the word colleagues, by feeling them inclusive in decision-making and planning, by inviting them to speak before officials and feeling a part of the whole thing, and just showing them the skills that they needed to act to elicit the best from their neighborhoods and the redevelopment of their local place. And I think that's what led to some of the things that I've seen. I believe within ethical culture, and I don't just say this romantically, I believe that within us are the tools for this new way of looking at ethics, this emergent ethical system. Adler said many things right. He also said some pretty stupid things, which is how I go through the day, usually each day myself. But within that, he glimpsed something of which there was no one else had gone before. He was blazing a trail and was trying to find language and ideas to support that. Sometimes he got right and sometimes he got wrong. But in his essence, there was something about the complexity of our innate moral ability, this innate thing which resides within us that perhaps was shaped by evolution. And that if we utilized it the way we've utilized our economy and other kinds of systems, that it could produce something more. And that it had a lot to do with right energizing, the right way that we engage people. And if we did that, this new thing begins to emerge. And we've seen that in our own society to a certain extent. And we're also feeling the pushback from those who are fearful of that kind of system. But this is not a time for shrinking. This is a time for continuing to push forward, because people are going to feel that something new is coming if we continue to increase autonomy and freedom, that we allow for diversity and chaos, that we allow for communication and participating together, but that we also bring this special need for reciprocity that allows it to move to the next level. So here we are in spring, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a good time to think about emergence. Every time I walk out the door, I'm heading to the Botanical Gardens later today, just because it reminds me of what's possible, that flowering can come back again and again. I want to leave you with a little piece of poetry from one of my favorite authors, the poet Mary Oliver, who basically says, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. But meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. It calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Curt. Ah, what a wonderful springboard for us, I think. Very energizing. We do have some time for questions and answers. So if people would like to ask a question of Curt, please use your electronic hand raising. For those on the telephone, remember to use *9 to raise your hand and then wait to be called upon to unmute. I just want to say, Curt, that David and I are heading to the continental west, and we'll be in some dark sky parks and looking forward to seeing many more stars than we can see here on the East Coast. So looking forward to that. All right, we have some hands raised, and I'd like to first call upon Edna and or Laszlo. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. Okay. I'd like to say thanks. I'd like to say thanks for Curt for this morning. This was like, I was waiting for it probably for 40 years since I was in college, where somebody has had this approach. Through physics, I was introduced to physicists like Prigogine and Bohm, who had the kind of views of these connections and complexity and emergence that's I think it's nonlinear, very important, that goes beyond the mechanical connections, but still doesn't go down in the precipice of possible divorcing yourself from reality. And so I was very gratified to hear this morning's talk, and it was around, coming back in waves for the last 20, 30 years. And my wife, she has enough of me talking about it. Oh, but it's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
probably referring to Robert Gluck's book on chaos theory that was popular about 20 years ago, and some other physicists who've been talking about the emergence within physical systems with the math that's coming out. It's very exciting for them as well.
And in ethical, but height penetrates it, and of course it has even further use of the I and thou view of how you are not just within yourself and your internal compassion, but you ultimately, there are these connections that you don't even perceive how it, the complexity of these connections. I used to be joking with my friends about spooky actions at a distance that Einstein used to talk about it, that may be part of physics, some part of the physical explanations of these connections, not necessarily.
I love, that's interesting, yeah.
Thank you, Laszlo. I'd like to ask Diane Kozarski to please unmute yourself.
Thank you. So if these tendencies are so built into nature and we're just kind of perceiving them in more intricate detail, how come, I mean, it seems like conservative attitudes, authoritarianism, tribalism, racism, they're so deeply embedded in our cultures. What's the natural analog to those forces?
Right. So the people who do kind of ethics based on emergence would also say that these capacities within us do exist, but they can also be easily exploited. And then shown time and time again that people can use portions of this to move ahead and to build something. But ultimately, the reason why those systems collapse is because part of the process was not there. You know, when I'm listening to someone talking and they're going on that we want to do this ethically and it makes sense morally, and we just need to exclude this group of people, I immediately say, I see the flaw in your error. Or that we need to all agree to the same thing and work together under patriotism, or that we need something like that. That if you start with a model like Adler's doing of right energizing, and you notice that they're trying to put imposing on the system in ways that he thought would also lead us astray, I think that's what is there. But certainly biologists would say it's possible for a system to exist for a short time and exceed for a short time. But the long-term sustainability and the rest of the resilience of that system are not there, and it collapses if all of the component parts are not there. And so I've looked at a lot of these other moral systems, shall we call them, in the United States, and they certainly are trying to use pieces of this. You know, Adam Smith's capitalism, of course, showed that there is a lot of energy to produce more, but it also lent itself to slavery, correct? So just like Marxism led to gulags and oppression also. So there has to be all of the component pieces in there to make this a moral system, I think is what Adler was, in his 19th century language, was trying to get at.
Okay.
Thank you. Pam, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much, Curt. That was a really wonderful program this morning. And I want to look at something that I just realized when you were talking about.
Yes.
Let me put it this way. If you look at nature, the birds and the flowers and the bees, their ecosystem works because they're programmed the robin is programmed to look for the worm to eat the food. On the other hand, we're programmed to challenge what we see. We learn that in order to stay healthy, we need to eat healthy foods. So our brains are working in our ecosystem, whereas in the nature, they have no brain. There is no something where they learn about how to live. How do you find what I'm saying?
Well, it's your birthday, so I won't pick on you. So, be nice to you. I, there's to a certain extent, you point out something unique about the evolution of humans. We did evolve, and once again, this is not something we thought about and then created. We evolved with the ability of cognition, which allowed us to perhaps protect ourselves in our own environment, right? Ecologically, we don't have claws, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't run very fast, we can't climb very fast, we can't do all these things, but we are pattern-seeking animals, as Michael Shermer would say, and that we do have some capacities for reasoning and making predictions from things which perhaps led to our survival. But don't forget the other part of this, like E.O. Wilson and others have pointed out, that we also evolved a capacity for caring, a capacity for empathy, a capacity for feeling that when one baby's in a room and starts crying, other babies start to cry as well. That we are connected in other kinds of ways, which have to do with a lot of innate capacities that we could use to our abilities. And so it is correct on your part to not compare us exactly with the robin or with the worm or the hawk or the ecosystem. We are part of ecosystems as well. We evolved in a time 100,000, 200,000 years ago when we were evolving these survival things called caring and empathy and cognition, that those were in an ecological system, and that we could, this innate capacity, right energize it, I think is what Adler is suggesting, and find a way to use that to our advantage. We think about colonizing the moon, which the jury is still out now for a lot of people, not only scientists, but non-scientists about that. But if we're going to try and bring life beyond Earth, even to the moon or to a space station or to Mars, if we could do that, if we could be the intelligence and their cognition to bring life force to a new planet, we're going to have to think in levels far deeper than we do about how we're connected to nature. We will not survive by merely just creating nutrients and things like that. We have to be in a reciprocal system. And that's the kind of evolutionary, for me as a environmental scientist, that's the thing I bring, that we cannot, we built a very good system of humans and have used capitalism to get us to this point, but we've also exploited all of nature to get there. There's only 9% of the forest left in the United States. There's 1.5% of prairie left in the United States. There's less than 3% of marshland left in the United States. And we've dammed most of the rivers. So we did create this tremendous capitalist wonder here, but we did this by sucking the life out of the rest of nature to get there in a non-sustainable and non-resilient ways. Now let's use our intelligence that we were given and our caring capacity and the science to listen to the rest of nature and communication and dialogue and reinvent new structures that can be more and more resilient and sustainable. Long answer to that, but there's.
Thank you.
Thank you. Terry, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Thanks, Curt. I loved your talk. I really like the ideas of evolutionary psychology that I think you were building on there. I find those ideas persuasive. But I understand that many biologists and sociologists claim these are just so stories that can not be verified scientifically and can be used to justify anything you care to justify. So how do you respond to that criticism? Because I've tried, but not been that successful.
Well, their argument is that these are merely spindles, right? That these are offshoots or kind of sub-behaviors, and that our deeper routine behaviors are far different from that. And if we focus on the offshoots and not on the main course, that we're off direction. We also cannot, and should say this, even with the biologists, you can't make predictions about where the new ecosystem is going. We can look backwards and see how we went from paramecium, perhaps to squid, to sequoias, to Homo sapiens, and eventually to dogs. See, I put them at the highest level of creation there. that we can see how these things may have added together, but we can't predict what the next point is going to be for dogs, and that's when it becomes pseudoscience at that point, if you're trying to say that. Other scientists disagree with that because there's a difference for them between what is called the teleological end, which we're trying to make predictions, and teleomnomic, which means that the body, we can say that the body has a certain way and has organs and the way it functions in its attempts to survive, that it needs to make improvements in order for these things to happen. That's not saying it has a divine purpose or it's heading for some goal, but that there are ways in which some things teleonomically make more sense, and therefore evolution allows those things to happen. So I disagree that it's merely a spindle because we don't have this. But I also, I don't want to make false predictions. I want to make sure that we're mathematically modeling these things and we're doing well. But I think those can be done in an ethical system as well. I feel pretty strong about that, but I'm writing a whole book about that. And so I do believe that we are heading in the right direction. This is new territory for a lot of people. And the emergence of the science is only in the last 20 years. But it's a pretty exciting time. And it doesn't meet our old reductionist model. That was the problem with science. If you reduce everything to components, parts, it's this, it's this, it's this. They never added up to the global whole. And that was the problem with science for many, many years, right? To trying to figure out, well, how do, if we keep reducing things, we put these things together and it's much more than it ever was before. And it's not since chaos theory and those things that we could say, well, actually they can, and they do this through this complex mathematical system. Long, convoluted answers say, Terry, you're darn right, and you should stick with your guns there.
Thank you. I see no more hands, so thank you,
The rest
Curt.
are befuddled. That's what happens, you know. Befuddle people, and they just kind of look at you like, I have no idea what this guy was just talking about. But
It was a beginning conversation, Curt, I think. Okay, thank you very much, Curt, for this thought-provoking morning. For more information about our society, here's a brief video.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.